Hi everyone, my name is Irex. Welcome to our English class. Today we will be tackling about later periods in American literature. Which will give focus on the American Republic and the contemporary period. Before we proceed to our formal lesson, we will be guided by our following objectives. At the end of the lesson, listeners are able to or expected to tell something about the prolific literature of America. The second one is define and differentiate regionalism, realism, and industrialization. And the third one is find out the pedagogical advantages of the American Republic and the contemporary period. Okay, so also in this lesson, we will be tackling about regionalism and cultural independence and realism and industrialization. Okay, so the American Republic and the contemporary period. So here is the brief background about this. So many of us know, we're all aware that the history of American literature stretches across more than 400 years. So it can be divided into major periods, which each period has a unique characteristics, and at the same time, notable authors and representative works or masterpieces. But today we'll give focus on the contemporary period. So, a contemporary literature, it is a vast group of written works produced from a specific time in history through the current age. So, take note of this, okay? That the contemporary period, it focuses on the current age, okay? So, other critics or some scholars call this era or this literary era as a time period or the current period. But it also describes a particular style and quality of writing. So, some critics see this period as an extension of the postmodern literature, but other scholars refer to it as a literary era of its own. Why extension of postmodern literature? Because after the World War II, from postmodern, so it was followed by the contemporary period. That's why they believe that the contemporary period or the current period was influenced or the extension of the postmodern literature. So, few scholars claim this period started at the end of World War II, and this is where the era pairing with postmodern literature comes in. So, this is what I am telling to you earlier. So, since the postmodern era began after World War II or in the 1940s, and that lasts in 1960s, so contemporary period it extends to the current day. So, take note of that, extends to the current day. Okay, so now here's the characteristics of the contemporary period. So, typical characteristics of the contemporary period, it includes reality-based stories with strong characters and believable stories. Also, settings usually keep to the current or modern era. And next, it features stories that are more character-driven than plot-driven. So, reality based. Take note of that, okay? That contemporary period, that it is a reality based stories. So, which give focus on the reality or what is happening on the environment or the surroundings. So, the next one is settings usually keep to the current or modern era. So, meaning to say that the futuristic, take note of this, okay? We disregard in this contemporary period the futuristic or not totally disregard. So we only rarely include the futuristic or sometimes the science fiction novels because we focus here on the reality based stories. That's why our setting should be on a current or in modern era. The third one is feature stories that are more character driven than plot driven. Okay, so focus is more on the characters. Okay. So next one is a contemporary literature is it features somewhat a modern narrative. So this is what I'm telling to you earlier, guys, okay? So but it also contains a harsher reality. So later on I will be telling to all of you why writings and contemporary period contains harsher reality. because contemporary written works tend to be influenced by the prosperous lifestyle that followed World War II. But this literary class is rooted in the devastation that war brought to the world. So, meaning that a new reality blossomed in the post-war mind and include a personal cynicism. Or so this is what a harsher reality is, that after the World War II, or the it blossom, it give rise to the post-war mind that to come up on personal cynicism, or to write something about personal cynicism, sometimes delusionment, sometimes about frustration that is common to this literary period. So here is the authors and their work during the contemporary period. Okay, so as if you remember, guys, Richard Wright. So Richard Wright wrote about the autobiography of a black boy, which published in 1945. So this writing of Richard Wright, because he's an African American, it shaped in many ways the writings in contemporary period, because this autobiography, when he left States from France after the World War II, this autobiography repulsed by the injustice and discrimination he faced as a black man in America. So meaning to say, he wrote in the biography his experiences, where other black writers working in the 1950s through the 1970s was also wrestled with a desire to escape an unjust society and to change it. So meaning to say, very inspiring, this kind of story of Mr. Richard Wright, and that influenced other authors to write the same and something to change the unjust society. So the next one is James Baldwin. He wrote a story about Go Tell It to the Mountain. So this novel talks about racism, sexism throughout his life. So here is next is the writings of Lorraine Hansberry, A Raisin in the Sun. So this Raisin in the Sun published in 1959, which it plays about the effects of racism in Chicago. So the next one is the autobiography of Malcolm X. So in which it talks about, or is sought to generate uniquely black consciousness, meaning to say he wants that his writing would be an opener to open the conscious mind of the black, or the black Americans. And the next one is Toni Morrison's first novel, which is The Bluest Eye, in which it talks about putting the lives of black women at its center. So take note of this, guys, that this novel of Toni Morrison's, she received a Nobel Prize in 1993. The next one is Alice Walker in the year 1960. So Alice Walker, he began writings on the 1960s, where most of his novels, at the same time poetry and short stories, reflected in her involvement in the civil rights movement. So as you can see, guys, through the authors and their writings, they wrote their experiences of what is happening on their environment, of what is the social issues of something like about sexism, racism, sometimes the civil rights movements, or what is the rights of the women, of the workers in the economy, on the offices, or something like that. Okay, so I hope that gives you a clear understanding about the contemporary period. So now we will proceed to discussing regionalism and cultural independence. Okay, so in American literature, regionalism, it refers to works that describe a distinctive local geography and culture, and to movements that value smaller scale representation of place over representation of broad territorial range. So that's why regionalism it emerged from the perception of modern geographic plurality. So where writers and readers understand a large unit of space is commonly the national territory, because from the word regionalism, region, it gives about the gives idea about the national territory, which to be diversified at its periphery according to topographical features. Because in this regionalism, most of their writings give focus on the topography about the place, the geography, so something like that. And sometimes it also includes the economy of the place, the history of the place, the dialect, and at the same time the morality or the manners. So here, a region is always one among many within a common container or something. It always included, which characterized by an even development between the center and the periphery. So the next one is regionalism indicates that a writer has chosen to focus on one of the areas outside the centers of power and to organize the work around that region. Because in American literature, regionalism has been associated with the sketch or short story. And also, it older category can accommodate poetry and novels. So, some of the critics of regionalism or those regionalism detractors, they have treated they treated regionalism as a minor form of portraying outdated folkways. So, see, there are some critics or there are some scholars who think of regionalism as something that is very minor or very little of portraying outdated folkways. So many to say are it is more parochial than literature that features a larger spatial scale and cosmopolitan characters. While some of those defenders of this writings of regionalism, they tend to reject that evaluation of the detractors, wherein they believe that regionalism it's something a writing that focuses, that provide access to pay mill, especially to non-white or those Black Americans and rural writers, which who use the form of innovative and empowering ways. So, meaning to say, they saw regionalism as a key for them to have an access to female or to the Black American, and at the same time, and a kind of literature that could empower women or that could empower people and make some more innovations in order for them to be recognized and to something they could express on what should people treat them. So something like that. So here, regionalism is also in the 19th century. The term gets interchangeably with local color. Okay, so take note of this, guys. Local color. So local color, when we say local color, it is or also called a regional literature, which a fiction or poetry that focuses on the characters, dialects, customs, topography, and other features of particular to a specific region. Okay, so take note of that, okay? When we say regionalism, other used to call it as local color. Okay, so here's the characteristics of the regionalism. The first one is the setting or a place. So when it comes to setting, the emphasis is frequently on nature. So why on nature? Because regionalist writers, they tend to focus their settings on something on a far-flung areas or frequently remote and inaccessible, because this is something where we can describe really what is within the place, about the environment, if there is more trees, if there's flowers, what about the sunrise or something like that. So also the setting here is very integral. So when we say integral, it's very important to the story and may sometimes become a character in itself. So the next one is characters. So in characters, it's concerned with the character or the district or region rather than with the individual. Because here, the characters may become our character types, which sometimes quaint or stereotypical. So the characters here are marked by their adherence to the old ways. So something like that when we are about to describe here the characters of the story, when it talks about the regionalism, so you will truly recognize the character by describing some old ways about his, sometimes it's through his dialect or by describing him through his particular personality, the trait central to the region. Something that you would describe a character through his manner, and then you will identify that that is a personality of the character in the story. So while in women's local color fiction, it talks about the heroines and sometimes the unmarried women or young girls. So something like that. Those are the focuses sometimes of regionalism in order for us to recognize the character or the subject of the story. So now we proceed to the narrator. Sorry, narrator. So here the narrator is typically an educated absorber of the world beyond. So meaning to say, narrator should be knowledgeable, which is because he is the one who will show sometimes a sympathetic attitude, sometimes ironic, or sometimes who knows how to distance himself or herself from what he is writing, because the narrator is sometimes serves as a mediator, or something that put himself or herself between what he is writing, or sometimes he put himself between or mediates the rural folk of the tale and at the same time to the urban audience to whom the tale is directed. So the next one is plot. So the plot stories may include lots of storytelling and revolve around the community and its rituals. So it revolves around the community and its rituals in order for us to understand, the readers might understand really about what is within that community of the particular society of what the tale is directed. So something like that, which we can recognize their traditions, their culture, so or what is the happenings within the community. So those are what included in a plot. So the next one is the themes. When it comes to themes, many local color stories, it shares an antipathy to change and a certain degree of nostalgia for an always past golden moments or age. Like for example, a celebration of community and acceptance in the face of adversity, characterize women's local color fictions, where thematic tension or conflict between the urban ways and the old-fashioned rural values is sometimes symbolized by the intrusion of an outsider or interloper who seeks something from the community. So sometimes those are the themes wherein sometimes the difference between the urban ways and the rural folks, or what is within the rural folks and what is within the urban ways or the urban area. Okay, so now here are the writers, some famous writers of regionalism. So if you're familiar with William Faulkner, Zora Neale Hurston, Flannery O'Connor, and Theodore Welty, while others are Will Cather, Stegner, Silko, and Gloria Anzaldúa. So they are one of the famous writers of regionalism. Okay, so before we proceed to realism, so now what is the importance of regionalism? So I want you to take note or to keep in mind that regionalism is important. Aside from what I have mentioned earlier, because it has become more effective if we the natives of our regions are the ones who will value our language and understand our culture, just like what I've said earlier, that the culture, rituals, traditions are included, and there's regionalisms and they're to emphasize what is within the community. So by learning and reading literary pieces from the regions, we feel something that it can make a readers proud, especially if the tale is directed to their place, right? So sometimes you will feel proud because you will truly believe the power of the native tongue that intensifies the words and creates an impact on the soul, right? So that's why just put yourself in the shoes of the reader. So which tales is directed to their community or to the society, that you will be proud that somebody knows about their culture, that somebody knows about their traditions or their practices, right? Or somebody knows about what is the characters between the area of their manners or their popularity and personality traits, right? Okay, so regionalism concerns process and story. So meaning to say it is more than an artifact. Remember this. Regionalism, it is more than an artifact because it's process, story, and concerns process and the story. So it also concerns with emphasizing the moral particularity of a population bounded by the territory and with valorizing regional culture as a means to create regional identity. So like I said earlier that regionalisms will indeed create a regional identity because we'll be familiar about the place. Well, the place with such names because of its culture, we can name them. Just like for example, here in the Palawanio, we'll be having a regional identity if one of the writings will discuss about the Cuyonon dances, about our dialects Cuyonon, about our practices, or sometimes in other places like in Bicol or in Ilocano, so something like that. There were some descriptions that would totally create identity about the place and its people. Okay, so that is the regionalism is all about. So I hope you learned something from it. So now we will proceed to realism. Okay, so realism, it begins on 1860 and to 1890. So here, guys, when trying to understand realism in literature, just think of the word real, okay? Just think of this word, real, okay? So rather than applying filters or fantasy to your fictional world, realism is based on a real everyday life. So realism in literature is something like that you would compare it taking a photo before adding all your Snapchat filters. So right? So in realism you'll find characters with genuine jobs and sometimes problems. Okay, so for example, the work of realism might chronicle the life of an average farmer. So rather than fun metaphors, rather than making metaphors or imagery or focuses on the imagination or fictional, then you would come up easily or immediately on identifying what the chronicle of an average farmer by showing the undramatized life or the dialect of that particular area. So something like that. So here, Walt Whitman during the World War II, he says that a great literature will arise out of the era of those 4 years. Because during that time, the human cost of the Civil War in the United States was immense. It was more than 2.3 million soldiers fought in the war, and perhaps or maybe as many as 851,000. So can you imagine? 851,000 people died on that war. So Walt Whitman, he thinks of it. He claimed that after the World War, there is a great literature that will arise out of the era of those 4 years. So that's why he envisioned that this literature will present a detailed, remember this guys, okay, will present a detailed and an embellished vision of the world. Okay, so literary realism is a literary movement that represents reality by portraying mundane, sometimes everyday experiences as they are in real life. It also depicts familiar people, places, stories, and primarily about the middle and lower classes of society. Also, those are the topics of or focuses or the themes of realism. So, literary realism also seeks to tell a story as truthfully as possible instead of dramatizing or romanticizing it. So, meaning to say, romanticizing or dramatizing a story is rarely included in story because they focus on what is real or reality based or what is the truth. So, in American realism, realism, it is a reaction to or a rejection to what we call romanticism. Just like what I said earlier, that realism, it is something that disregard romanticizing of the story. So just like here, it rejects the figure of romanticism, which, as if you remember that romanticism, it gives focus on the emotion, the imagination, and at the same time the feelings of an individual. Here in realism, it focuses on the truth, or it gives it tells a story as truthfully as possible. Okay, so broadly defined as realism, it is broadly defined as the faithful representation of reality or verisimilitude. Okay, so another grammar to take note. Okay, so although strictly speaking, realism is a technique, it also denotes a particular kind of subject matter. So I mentioned to you earlier what are the common themes, so you can use that, especially if your teachers would allow you to write a story that which focus is realism. So, like what I've said earlier, it is a reaction against romanticism, where an interest in the scientific method, the systematic of the study of documentary history, and the influence of rational philosophy all affected the rise of realism. So, literary realism represents reality by portraying mundane literary experiences they are in real life. Okay, so here, to better understand realism, here are the characteristics of realism. So, realism, it is the story, realistic characters and setting, where you can focus on the current era or the modern era. When next is comprehensive detail about everyday occurrences. The next one is plausible plot, or the story sometimes that could happen in your town or in community or society. So sometimes it's very, very convincing. Next one is real dialects of the area. So take note of this, okay? So some of the realists used the dialects of that particular area in order for convince readers to know much better about what is within that area. Because just like regionalism, realism also used by the writers in order for them to convince readers to open up their minds about what is happening on their local area, or what is happening on, or what are the current issues that they are facing. So something like that. So it is also character development is which is character development important, and the next one is it defects social class. Okay, so take note of that characteristics. Okay. Then now let's proceed to the types of literary realism. So there are a few different types of literary realism. So each of with its own distinct characteristics. So the first one is magical realism. So guys, take note of this. Okay, when we say magical realism, it is a type of realism that blurs or fades the lines between the fantasy and reality. Meaning to say that magical realism, it portrays the world truthfully plus adds magical elements that are not found in reality but still considered normal in the modern world that the story takes place. Just like if you remember the writing of Miss Gabriel Garcia Marquez, published in 1957, which he produced a 100 Years of Solitude. He write that this magical realism novel about a man who invents a downtown according to its own perception. So see, that is a type of magical realism example. Next is social realism. So when we say social realism, it is a type of realism that focuses on the lives and living conditions of the working class and the poor. So next is the kitchen sink realism. So when we say kitchen sink realism, it is an offshoot of social realism that focuses on the lives of young working class. When we say kitchen sink realism, focuses on the lives of young working class. Okay. So the next one is naturalism. I know that all of you guys are familiar with this because it was influenced by an extreme form of realism that is influenced by Charles Darwin theory of evolution, in which it talks about environmental phenomena. So the next one is psychological realism. So when we say psychological realism, it is a type of realism that is character driven. So just like what I mentioned earlier, that realism, one of its characteristics is more on character driven than flat driven. So it is helped by psychological realism with focusing on what motivates them to make certain decision and why. So psychological realism sometimes uses characters to express commentary on social or political issues. Okay, so those are the types of literary realism. Okay, so here now, the famous realist writers and their work. So the first one is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. So Mark Twain is very famous realist writer. So this Adventures of Huckleberry Finn talks more about wherein he recounts something that could have easily happened during the time period. Not only did they capture the dialect of the time, but examines the real-life events unfolding in the far country as Huck and Jim float down the Mississippi. So that is just a brief background of this story. The next one is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. So in his Civil War novel, This red badge of courage invited readers to explore the real life of a soldiers during the time we're in. Meaning that the red badge of courage, it talks about the life of the soldiers during the World War. So his novels shine a lot on the conditions of children with the realities of the battlefield. So the next one is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. So it's set in the Great Depression because Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, it reveals the stark realities of people living in the impoverished conditions. So meaning to say, take note of this, okay? Of Mice and Men, it talks about realities of people living in the impoverished conditions or those in the low-lying areas. So through the novel, you follow the flight to working class men of time and the economic difficulties they encounter. So it also works to shine the light on the prejudices and isolation of those working with disabilities. So guys, through their examples, you will truly understand that realism talks about the social phenomena of social concern or social issues. The next example is Life in the Iron Mills by Rebecca Harding Davis. It is an acclaimed novelist of her time where Rebecca Harding Davis illuminates the bleak working conditions of early industrial workers and the poor. She was one of the first realism writers in the America to put a feminist perspective on the world around her. Okay. Here is the importance of realism. Okay, let's have like this question in mind. Why realism is important or why literary realism is important? Okay, so realism is important because it has become part or an important instrument in shaping America's self-identity as a nation. Because just like what I've said, it empowered those readers about what is within their reality. They became aware about what is happening in their surroundings, their environment, or what are those current events and issues. Also, literary is very important because it is a unique genre that looks at real life people and situations. Just like what I've said earlier, take note of the word real. It talks about real life people and situations. So it even explores real dialogues of people. Not only does this work to make an interesting story, but it gives people a look into a raw and unfiltered conditions of the time. So it can also be a powerful commentary to enact change for for specific people groups. So see that those of the writings became an eye-opener for those readers to create change, to create impact to the people, to change for a specific people group. This is something that they want, something that we would like to fight for, so they could use their writings in order for them to be guided about the things that they should do, or something that they will be still open about the current and social issues. Okay, so that's the end of realism. So now let's proceed to industrialization. Okay, so guys, don't be confused, okay? Industrialization and realism is interconnected to one another, but I just separate it in order for us to understand. But later on, I will include here in my discussion about industrialization the importance of realism, okay? Okay, so the industrialization of the United States after the Civil War led to many changes in the cultural because the growth of machines. When we say industrialization, there is a growth of machines where there is an unskilled factory jobs and wage labor, where those kind of situations created loss for many Americans who'd grown up self-reliant. So the changes in the country helped shape American literature as the new realities of life gain a sense of realism. So meaning to say, those happenings in industrialism where there is a group of machines, where it affects some of those Americans who are self-reliant. So those are some of the focuses of American literature, or in order for them to give rise to what is happening or to give rise to the new realities and gains a sense of realism. So, as if you remember that during the Victorian period, the Industrial Revolution spurred a massive social, political, and economic process of change. So take note of that, okay? That it attracted and refilled by this transformation where writers produce an explosion of essays. Okay. So remember of this, guys. Because of the massive social, political, and economic process, because of the change massive change in social, political, and economic because of industrial revolution. It serves as a transformations to or led to other writers to produce essays, novels, poems, plays, and autobiographies and journalisms, wherein they could talks about that which are in the focus of their or the subject of their writings, or it talks about the industrial revolution. So many attempt to address, or some of the writers attempt to address about the machine culture as an urgent social force and literary topic. Why, especially during the height of realist industrial fiction and social criticism in the year 1830s and 1950s. So those are the focuses of their writings. Okay, so industrial revolution spurred a massive social, political, and economic process of change. So this is what I'm saying earlier, that because of industrial revolution, it opens up some of the writers to create writings which subjects or which focuses will talks about the machine culture as an urgent force and as an urgent social force in literary topic. So now, here I have some questions to you guys. How did the Industrial Revolution affect American culture? So, industrialization and the rise of realist literature, it affects American culture because of because of the growth of the machinery, because of the changes in their economy. There is some issues that totally affects the literature of the American, where the writers were influenced by the changes or by the happenings. Okay, so how did industrialism affect um, literature? So industrial revolution has significant influence on the themes and language of literary works in the 18th century. Okay, take note of this, okay? Revolution has significant influence on the themes and language of literary works in the 18th century. So, in the Industrial Revolution, writers used literature as a mean of criticism. So, see, as a mean of criticism. So, that's the themes were mainly about social issues, nature, and technology. Okay, so take note of this about the main theme of industrialization talks about also the same with realism, talks about social issues, nature, and technology. Okay, so class, so that's the end of my discussion. So I hope you learned something from it, okay? So, but before I'm going to end my discussion, I want to give you an insight about why is it important for us to learn about literature. So it is important for us to learn about literature because it allows a person to step back in time and learn about the life on earth from the ones who walked before us. So I want to give you an insight in order for you to have an eye open why we should read, why we should learn about them. So we can also gather an understanding of culture, their traditions, rituals, and practices of other people, and we could also have a greater appreciation of them. So we learn through them the ways of what is history is recorded and in the forms of manuscripts and through speech itself. Okay, so that's why read, and we can learn more and we can be more appreciative, understand, and knowledgeable about what is really what happened about in the past, and at the same time the current events about what the existing literatures of the past and which now it's totally exists and their importance and how it changed people's lives and at the same time the society. So again, thank you very much for listening. This is iRex. So thank you very much and thank you for listening. Goodbye, guys.